Major Jack Sterling of the 75th Ranger Regiment was a man who understood the mathematics of violence. In the summer of 2000, he was stationed as a tactical observer at the British High Commission in Freetown, Sierra Leone. He had spent his career studying force ratios and kinetic envelopes. He believed in the doctrine of the United States Army: overwhelming fire superiority, massive logistical tails, and the absolute necessity of a 3-to-1 advantage before initiating a breach. So, when he stood in a humid, map-strewn planning room in Freetown and heard that the British were planning to assault 2 fortified jungle camps with just 40 men, he didn't just disagree. He felt a profound sense of professional pity. "You're going to lose them all," Sterling told his British counterpart, a gaunt SAS major from D-Squadron. "The West Side boys have 400 men, heavy machine guns, and a terrain advantage that makes the Mekong Delta look like a golf course. You don't have enough boots. You don't have enough air. You're inviting a slaughter." The SAS major didn't look up from his topographic map. He didn't argue about the numbers. He just adjusted a single red pin on the village of Berry Barna and said 6 words that Sterling would never forget. "We aren't planning to stay long." The crisis that led to this moment was one of the most humiliating setbacks for the British military in the post-Cold War era. On August 25, 2000, a patrol from the Royal Irish Regiment had been intercepted by a militia known as the West Side Boys. The British patrol had taken a wrong turn, found themselves surrounded and, seeking to avoid a bloodbath in a civilian-heavy area, had surrendered. To the world, the images were devastating. British soldiers, professional, well-equipped and highly trained, were shown on global news, stripped of their gear, standing barefoot in the mud, surrounded by teenagers in wigs and women's dresses, brandishing rusted AK-47s. But for Jack Sterling, the images were more than a PR disaster. They were a warning of a new kind of enemy. The West Side Boys weren't just a militia, they were a cult of the damned. Led by a man who called himself Brigadier Papa, Fede Calais, they were a drugged, unpredictable and hyper-violent force that lived in the Rokel Creek swamps. They believed that certain rituals and charms made them immune to bullets. They were fueled by brown, a mixture of cocaine and gunpowder. And they had spent years practicing a form of brutality that had turned Sierra Leone into a graveyard. They were unpredictable in a way that modern military computers can't model, Sterling noted in his initial report to the Pentagon. They were prone to sudden, irrational outbursts of violence. They moved through the mangrove swamps of Magbeni and Berry Barna like they were part of the root system. They had heavy weapons, mortars and ZPU-2 anti-aircraft guns, positioned to cover the only 2 landing zones in the area. By every metric of US Army Special Operations Command, these camps were hardened targets, requiring at least a battalion-strength element to suppress. The Pentagon offered help. They offered a task force of US Rangers, supported by an entire carrier strike group and a fleet of MH-47 Chinooks. They proposed a 72-hour bombardment, followed by a massive cordon and search operation. It was the American way: flatten the jungle, then count the bodies. The British refused. They didn't want a battalion. They didn't want a carrier. They wanted 40 men from D-Squadron, 22nd SAS, and a handful of Special Boat Service, SBS, divers. When Sterling saw the SAS operators arrive at the Lungi airport, he was even more convinced that a catastrophe was imminent. They didn't arrive with the high-speed polish of Delta Force or the SEALs. They stepped off the C-130s, looking like gaunt, hollow-eyed ghosts. Their gear was worn, their uniforms were a mismatched collection of jungle DPM, and they spoke in quiet, abbreviated sentences that Sterling could barely follow. They looked under-resourced, Sterling recalled. They didn't have the integrated communication suites we used. They didn't have the thermal fusion optics that were becoming standard in the 75th. I saw one NCO sharpening a folding knife and another checking a compass that looked like it had been through the Falklands. I thought to myself, these men are going to be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the jungle. What Sterling failed to understand was that he was looking at a unit that had spent 60 years specializing in the economy of force. While the American doctrine was built on the platform, the tank, the helicopter, the drone, the SAS was built on the operator. Specifically, the operator produced by a selection process that stripped away everything but the primal ability to function under absolute, crushing pressure. Sterling spent the next 5 days watching the SAS prepare. He watched them build a full-scale mock-up of the Barras camp in the jungle near Freetown. He watched them practice the vertical entry, the art of fast roping from a hovering helicopter into a confined space, over and over again. But it wasn't the physical training that unnerved him, it was the silence. In a ranger company, you hear the noise of preparation, Sterling said. You hear the NCOs barking, the rattle of gear, the constant communication. With the SAS, the mock-up was silent. They cleared the village in the mock-up in a way that looked less like a military operation and more like a predatory hunt. There were no shouts. No one was giving orders. They all just knew. It was as if they were connected by a single nervous system. As the negotiations with Papa Fode Calais broke down, and it became clear that the militia intended to begin executing the hostages, the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, gave the order. Go. The mission was designated Operation Barras. It was the most dangerous hostage rescue attempted by the British since the Iranian embassy siege in 1980. The targets were 2 villages, Magbeni and Barras, separated by the Rokel Creek. The West Side boys had 400 men split between the two. The SAS had to hit both simultaneously to prevent one camp from killing the hostages when the other was attacked. Sterling was given a seat in the Joint Operations Center. He sat next to the SAS Major, his watch synchronized to the second. The American plan for this mission involved a massive, multi-staged air assault. The British plan was simpler. They were going to fly 2 Chinooks directly into the middle of the camps at 6:15 in the morning. I looked at the flight path, Sterling recalled. The Chinooks would be flying low, over the river, right into the teeth of the militia's machine guns. At that altitude and speed, they were just big, slow-moving targets. I turned to the Major and said, "You're going to lose the birds before they even touch the LZ." The Major didn't answer. He just tapped his watch. The clock ticked towards 6:15. In the distance, through the thick pre-dawn mist of the Sierra Leone jungle, the heavy, rhythmic thump-thump of the Chinook rotors began to vibrate through the floor of the ops center. Sterling felt a knot in his stomach. He had seen Black Hawk Down in Somalia. He knew what happened when an elite unit underestimated the volume of the mob. He was waiting for the radio to erupt with the sound of chaos, for the reports of downed helicopters and trapped soldiers. He was waiting for the British to fail. What he didn't know was that he was about to witness a different species of warfare. A 20-minute miracle that would rewrite every tactical assumption he had ever made about the limits of the individual and the power of the thinking soldier. The 17-second clearance in Baghdad was still 5 years in the future. But the foundation of that speed, the cold, geometric precision that would eventually shock the Pentagon, was about to be unleashed in the swamps of Rokel Creek. And as the first Chinook flared over Barras, Jack Sterling realized that the slaughter he had predicted was indeed about to happen. But not to the men from Hereford. At 6:15 hours, the jungle of Sierra Leone didn't just wake up. It screamed. Major Jack Sterling, watching the digital telemetry in the Freetown Operations Center, held his breath as the icons for the 2 RAF Chinook helicopters, call signs Dolphin 1 and Dolphin 2, merged with the terrain markers for Magbeni and Gaberi Bana. In the American Ranger Regiment, an air assault was a choreographed symphony of suppression. You'd have AH-64 Apaches raking the tree lines with 30mm cannons, and door gunners saturating every square inch of the landing zone before a single boot touched the grass. It was about establishing the environment. The British were doing the opposite. They were flying into a hot LZ with the tactical equivalent of a blindfold and a prayer. The American manual says you don't land a heavy-lift helicopter in the middle of a hostile camp unless the enemy is suppressed or dead, Sterling noted. The British doctrine seemed to be fly in so fast and so low that the enemy doesn't have time to realize they should be shooting at you.
It was a gamble on human reaction time, a gamble that ignored the ballistic reality of a 12.7mm heavy machine gun versus a thin-skinned aluminium airframe. As the Chinooks flared, the massive rotors tilted back to bleed off speed in a maneuver that strained the airframes to their absolute structural limits. The West Side boys finally reacted. The brown, drugged stupor of the militia was shattered by the deafening downwash of the rotors. From the thatched huts of Gaberi Bana, hundreds of fighters poured out, screaming and firing AK-47s wildly into the air. Sterling watched the radio transcriptions. He expected to hear the chatter of chaos, the frantic calls for support that usually accompany a compromised landing. Instead, the SAS net was eerily quiet. There were no shouts, no panic, just the rhythmic, monosyllabic reports of the pilots and the team leads. Clear left, clear right, visual on the target building, dropping now. What Sterling was witnessing was the manifestation of a training cycle that had begun years earlier in the primary rainforests of Brunei. To understand why those 40 men didn't flinch as the jungle floor erupted in gunfire, you have to understand the jungle phase of SAS selection. In the American Special Forces Q course, the jungle is a classroom. In the SAS, the jungle is a predator. For 6 weeks in the heart of Borneo, candidates are pushed into a state of primitive awareness. They are taught that noise is death. They learn to navigate 500 meters of triple canopy forest in total darkness, moving so slowly that their heart rates never rise above 80 beats per minute. The SAS major in Hereford once told me that the jungle doesn't just hide you, it absorbs you, Sterling recalled. They trained their men to wait, to sit in a swamp for 72 hours without moving, letting the leeches and the heat become part of their daily reality. By the time an operator reaches a mission like Barras, his nervous system has been recalibrated. The sound of 1,000 drugged rebels screaming is just background noise. His focus is narrowed to a single point, the 17-second geometry of the room. As the first SAS operators fast roped from the Chinooks, they didn't land in a defensive posture. They landed in a sprint. The West Side boys had positioned ZPU-2 anti-aircraft guns in the center of the village. These were Soviet-made, twin-barreled monsters capable of shredding a Chinook in seconds. An American strike would have prioritized these with Hellfire missiles from 2 miles away. The SAS handled it differently. A 3-man element from the D-Squadron mountain troop hit the ground, ignored the incoming small arms fire, and sprinted directly toward the ZPU-2 position. They weren't seeking cover. They were neutralizing the threat through proximity. "I watched the drone feed," Sterling said, his voice reflecting a lingering disbelief. You could see the heat signatures of the militia trying to traverse the heavy guns, but the SAS operators were already inside the gun's minimum engagement range. They were too close to be hit by the big barrels. They cleared the gun crew with 3-round bursts from their C8 carbines, and then turned the ZPU-2 into a useless hunk of metal with a single thermite grenade. It was the most efficient piece of combat engineering I'd ever seen. No waste, no drama, just the removal of an obstacle.
Inside the huts, the hostages, the men of the Royal Irish Regiment, heard the thud of the grenades and the distinctive, rapid pop, pop, pop of the suppressed C8s. They knew the H hour had arrived, but they also knew the danger. Papa Fode Calais had given strict orders. If the camp is attacked, the hostages die first. The SAS entry team, led by a sergeant known only as H, reached the primary hostage building exactly 42 seconds after the helicopter flared. Sterling looked at the clock in the ops center. 42 seconds. In 42 seconds, they had traversed 60 meters of muddy ground, neutralized a heavy machine gun, and reached the threshold. In the Ranger Regiment, we would still be establishing our outer cordon. The British were already at the throat of the enemy. The door to the hostage hut was a heavy, reinforced wooden frame. The SAS didn't use a ram. They used a mini-strip charge, a precise line of plastic explosive that cut the hinges rather than blowing the door inward. It was about controlling the overpressure. If you blow a door into a small room, the shockwave can kill the very people you are there to save. The geometry of the entry was flawless, Sterling noted. H and his team entered the room in a staggered file. The first man went left, the second man went right, and the third man took the center. They were moving at a speed that looked blurred on the low frame rate surveillance feed. But it wasn't just speed. It was discrimination. Inside the hut, the darkness was absolute, lit only by the strobe-like flashes of the gunfire. The West Side boys inside the hut were panicked, fumbling for their weapons. The SAS operators were wearing AN/PVS-14 night vision, but they weren't relying on the technology alone. They were relying on instinctive marksmanship, a skill honed through hundreds of thousands of rounds in the Hereford killing house. They weren't aiming, Sterling explained. They were pointing. When you fired that many rounds, the weapon becomes an extension of your skeletal structure. You don't look through the sights in a room that small. You just know where the barrel is pointing. Every insurgent in that room was hit in the T-box, the bridge of the nose and the eyes. It was instant, neurological shutdown. There was no return fire. There was just the sound of bodies hitting the dirt. In the middle of the room, one of the Royal Irish hostages felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He didn't hear a shout of US Army or a loud identification. He heard a calm, almost bored British voice whisper in his ear, "Easy, mate. We're the BS. Time to go home." The BS. The boys. The regiment. Sterling watched as the heat signatures of the hostages were moved toward the waiting Chinook. The extraction was beginning, but the mission was only half finished. Across the creek, in Magbenny, the second camp was erupting. The West Side boys there were better prepared. They had seen the first Chinook and were now pouring a devastating volume of fire toward Dolphin 2. The second camp was a hornet's nest, Sterling recalled. The militia there had mortars. They started dropping rounds into the LZ. I saw Dolphin 2 take a hit to the rear pylon. It didn't go down, but the pilot was struggling to keep it level. I turned to the SAS major and said, "Pull them out. The mission is compromised. You've got the hostages. Let Magbenny go." The major didn't move. He didn't even look at Sterling. "We don't leave a job half done," the major said. "If we leave Magbenny standing, they'll be back in Freetown by tomorrow night. We aren't just here for the men. We're here to break the cult." This was the thinking soldier as a strategic instrument. The SAS wasn't just conducting a rescue. They were conducting a psychological amputation. They knew that the West Side boys relied on the myth of their own invincibility. If the SAS only rescued the hostages and fled, the myth would survive. To kill the myth, they had to destroy the camp,
the leadership, and the brown supply in a single, overwhelming stroke of violence. Sterling watched as the second SAS element, the boat troop, launched their assault on Magbeni. They didn't come from the air, they came from the water. While the Chinook provided a noisy distraction, 16 SBS and SAS operators had moved up the Rokel Creek in inflatable klepper canoes and Gemini craft, submerged to their necks in the black, stinking water of the mangroves.
They had been in the water for 4 hours, moving through the roots of the trees, waiting for the sound of the Chinook rotors. "I never saw them on the thermal," Sterling admitted. "The water was so warm and the mangroves were so dense that they were effectively invisible. They emerged from the mud like prehistoric predators. They didn't use explosives to enter Magbeni. They used knives and suppressed MP5s. They were inside the perimeter before the first mortar round even left its tube." The battle for Magbeni was different from Barras. It wasn't a room clearance, it was a clearing of the hive. Sterling sat in the ops center, the blue light of the screens reflecting in his eyes, as he realized that the mathematics of violence he had relied on his entire career were being rewritten in front of him. 40 men were systematically dismantling a force of 400, not through superior firepower, but through a superior tempo of decision-making. The West Side boys were fighting a war of noise and fear, Sterling concluded. The SAS was fighting a war of geometry and silence. And in the jungle, silence always wins. But the cost was about to mount. As the extraction phase began, a group of militia fighters, fueled by a final, desperate dose of drugs, managed to flank the SAS rear guard. The 20-minute miracle was about to enter its most dangerous phase. And Jack Sterling was about to see what happens when the thinking soldier is forced to stop thinking and start dying. Major Jack Sterling had seen hot extractions before. He had seen Rangers fight their way out of urban traps in Mogadishu and watched Delta Force operators navigate the chaos of the Balkans. But what he saw on the digital monitor at the Freetown Joint Operations Center during the height of Operation Barras was different. It wasn't just a battle. It was a collision between two different definitions of reality. On one side were the West Side boys, a drugged, erratic and terrified force of 400 firing thousands of rounds into the air in a desperate attempt to reclaim their myth of invincibility. On the other were 40 men who moved with a silence and a mechanical inevitability that Sterling found genuinely chilling. In Magbeni, the geometry of the 17-second room clearance met the chaos of the primeval swamp, Sterling noted. The village wasn't a collection of buildings. It was a cluster of thatched huts connected by knee-deep mud and dense elephant grass. Visibility was less than 5 meters. In those conditions, your million-dollar thermal optics are useless. The humidity fogs the lenses, and the heat of the jungle masks the heat of the man. It becomes a war of ears and skin. The boat troop element of the SAS, along with the SBS divers, had breached the Magbeni perimeter from the river. While the Chinooks provided the noise at Barras, these 16 men had crawled through the mangrove roots, their faces covered in a mixture of camouflage cream and stinking river silt. They carried the L119A1 carbine, the British version of the M4, but with one critical difference. Most of them had stripped off the sophisticated electronic sights. I asked one of the sergeants during the rehearsal why they were using iron sights, Sterling recalled. He told me, glass fogs, batteries die, and electronics glitch in the salt water. A piece of steel and a steady eye never fail. It was the British philosophy in a nutshell. If it can break, it shouldn't be on your rifle. As the boat troop moved into Magbeni, they encountered the Hornet's Nest. The West Side boys were regrouping. They had realized that the primary assault was across the creek, and they were preparing to cross the water to join the fight. The SAS didn't wait for them. They executed what they called a linear ambush in the middle of a moving village. "I watched the heat signatures," Sterling said. "They didn't form a defensive line. They moved into the center of the militia's barracks, stood back to back, and created a 360-degree perimeter of fire. It was a tactical suicide mission by American standards. You don't put yourself in the middle of the enemy. But for the SAS, it was about drawing the fire. They wanted every insurgent in Magbeni to focus on them, leaving the Chinook at Gberibana clear to extract the hostages. The volume of fire in Magbeni was staggering. The West Side boys were firing everything they had: AK-47s, RPG-7s, and the ZPU-2 anti-aircraft guns. The air was thick with lead and the smell of burning thatch. And then, the mathematics of violence finally claimed a price. Over the radio, a calm, clipped voice broke the silence. "Man down. Repeat, man down. Sector 4. We need a winch." The voice belonged to the patrol commander in Magbeni. One of the operators, Trooper Bradley Tinian, had been hit. He had been providing cover fire for the secondary entry team when a burst of fire from a hidden militia position caught him in the flank. Sterling felt a cold shiver. In an American operation, a man-down signal often triggered a massive shift in focus. Everything would stop to recover the casualty. Air support would be redirected, and the mission would enter a defensive phase. But the SAS didn't stop. "I watched the signatures," Sterling recalled, his eyes fixed on the screen. The team didn't collapse around Tinian. They didn't stop the clearance. The man directly behind him, the number 4 man, simply stepped over him, engaged the threat that had hit Tinian, and continued into the hut. The casualty was left to the designated medic of the team, who began treating him while still firing his carbine with one hand. It was the most brutal display of discipline I have ever witnessed. They prioritized the mission over the individual, not because they didn't care, but because they knew that if the mission failed, no one would get out. Tinian was severely wounded. A 7.62mm round had bypassed the side plate of his body armor. In the mud of Magbeni, with hundreds of drugged rebels closing in, his life was measured in minutes. The SAS major in the ops center didn't shout. He didn't curse. He leaned into the microphone and said, "Dolphin 1, you have a casualty at the tree line. Winch only. Do not land. Magbeni is too hot." Dolphin 1, the Chinook that had already extracted the hostages, re-entered the Magbeni airspace. The pilot, a man with nerves of steel, brought the massive 30-ton helicopter into a low hover directly over the elephant grass. The downwash was so intense it began to strip the thatch off the huts. It was a hover extract, Sterling noted. The most dangerous maneuver in aviation. The bird is a sitting duck. I saw RPGs trailing smoke through the air, missing the Chinook by meters. The door gunners were firing 7.62mm miniguns at a rate of 3,000 rounds per minute, creating a wall of steel around the helicopter. On the ground, the SAS medic hooked Tinian into the winch cable. As the wounded trooper was pulled into the air, the rest of the boat troop began their fighting withdrawal. They didn't run. They peeled. An SAS peel is a work of art, Sterling explained. One man fires, the other moves back. Then the next man fires while the first reloads. They move in a constant rolling wave of suppressed fire. The West Side boys were trying to rush them, but every time they moved, they walked into a 3-round burst from a C8. The British weren't wasting ammunition. They weren't spraying and praying. They were picking targets with the same cold deliberation they used in the Hereford killing house. As the boat troop reached the riverbank, they didn't wait for helicopters. They dived back into the stinking black water of the Rokel Creek. Sterling watched as the signatures disappeared from the thermal view, masked by the warm water. "They just vanished," he said. "One minute they were a lethal wall of fire, the next they were part of the swamp." The West Side boys were left shooting at shadows. Back in the ops center, the tension didn't break. The hostages were safe on Dolphin 1, but Tinian was in critical condition, and the militia in Megbeni was still operational. The SAS major turned to Sterling. "You asked how we move like that, Jack. We move like that because we don't have a choice. We don't have the luxury of a battalion to bail us out. We only have the man to our left and the man to our right." Sterling looked at the clock. 18 minutes. From the first flare to the last man in the water, 18 minutes. In that time, they had cleared 2 villages, rescued 11 hostages, and decimated a militia of 400. But the thinking soldier wasn't finished. The major looked at the map again. "The architect of this mess, Papa Faudet-Calais. We don't have him yet, and we aren't leaving until the head is off the sneak." "You've got a man dying on a Chinook," Sterling argued. "Your teams are exhausted. Megbeni is a furnace. You've won, Major. Leave it." The major looked at Sterling with that same quiet, institutional patience that Marcus Dunlap would later describe in Baghdad. "Winning isn't the objective, Jack," the major said. "The objective is the removal of the threat. If Calais stays in those woods, we'll be doing this again in 6 months. We finished the job. No." Sterling realized then that the different species didn't just have higher physical limits. They had a different definition of victory. To the SAS, a mission wasn't over when the hostages were safe. It was over when the enemy's capacity to resist was deleted from the map.
In the final phase of Operation Barras, the thinking soldier would have to navigate a final, desperate trap set by a man who had nothing left to lose. And Sterling would witness the moment where the geometry of the 17 seconds became a weapon of total psychological destruction. Major Jack Sterling sat in the blue-lit silence of the Freetown Operations Center, his eyes fixed on the timestamp. 6:37. 22 minutes had passed since the first Chinook flared over the Geberi-Bana huts. In the doctrine of the 75th Ranger Regiment, this was the extraction window. The moment you cut your losses, haul your casualties into the air, and let the gunship sanitize the area from 5,000 feet. But the SAS major standing next to him, his face as still as a carved flint, wasn't looking at the extraction telemetry. He was looking at a specific heat signature moving through the dense elephant grass on the northern edge of Megbeni. "Dolphin 1 has the hostages. Dolphin 2 is clear with the casualty," Sterling said, his voice tight with the urgency of a man who had seen perfect missions turn into massacres in the final seconds. "Pull the boat troop out, Major. The West Side boys are regrouping. They've got mortars in the tree line. You've won. Get your boys out of that swamp." The SAS major didn't blink. "We haven't won, Jack. We've only performed a rescue. If we leave now, Faudet-Calais is a hero. He becomes the man who survived a British Special Forces raid and kept his throne. Tomorrow, he'll have 500 new recruits. We didn't come here to rescue soldiers. We came here to delete a problem." Over the radio, a new voice broke the static. It was the lead scout from the boat troop, a man positioned deep within the Megbeni perimeter. "Visual on the brigadier. He's headed for the tunnel system, requesting permission to prosecute." The major leaned into the mic. "Prosecute. Bring him back alive if the geometry allows. If not, neutralize." Sterling felt a surge of professional disbelief. "A tunnel system? You're sending 4 men into a hole in the ground against a man who has nothing to lose? Major, that's not a mission. That's a suicide pact."
What Sterling was witnessing was the thinking soldier transitioning from the 17-second geometry of the room clearance to the long-form psychological warfare of the regiment. To understand why the SAS was willing to stay in the furnace of Magbeni to catch one man, you have to understand the nature of the enemy they were facing. The West Side Boys weren't a political movement. They were a drugged, ritualistic cult. Their power was built on the belief that Brigadier Papa Fode Calais possessed magical charms, juju, that made his followers immune to bullets. They wore wigs, women's dresses, and elaborate masks to confuse the spirits of death. As long as Calais was free, the magic was real. The SAS understands that in a counterinsurgency, the most dangerous weapon isn't the AK-47, it's the myth, Sterling noted in his private journal. The major knew that to break the militia, they had to humiliate the god. They had to show the teenagers in the wigs that their brigadier was just a frightened man in the mud. The hunt for Calais was a masterclass in jungle tracking, a skill that the SAS had refined since the Malayan emergency in the 1950s. While the American military was investing in ground-moving target indicator, GMTI, radar, the British were still training their men to look for the broken leaf and the pressed blade of grass. In the Magbeni swamp, the four-man SAS element, the tracking cell, moved with a method they called the shadow step. They didn't move as a unit, they moved as a staggered line of shadows, each man covering a specific sector of the undergrowth. I couldn't see them on the drone feed, Sterling recalled. The canopy was too thick, but I could hear them on the net. There was no heavy breathing, no frantic chatter, just the occasional click of a radio handset, a non-verbal signal that they had found a fresh sign. They found Calais in a spider hole, a reinforced dugout concealed beneath the roots of a massive silk cotton tree. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by his personal guard, 6 fighters fueled by a final desperate dose of brown. The engagement lasted exactly 9 seconds. The SAS team didn't use grenades. The confined space of the tunnel would have turned the overpressure into a lethal wave for everyone inside. Instead, they used point-man discrimination. The lead operator entered the hole with a suppressed L119A1 and a high-intensity tactical light. In the American system, we would have fragged the hall, Sterling said, at Cipher, at standard, but the British wanted the man. I heard the thud of the suppressed rounds, 3 targets neutralized instantly. Then a shout in a thick Scottish accent, "Drop the switch, Fuddy! Drop it or I'll take your head off!" Calais had been holding a hand grenade with the pin pulled. He was paralyzed by the speed of the entry. He had expected a battalion of screaming rangers. Instead, he was staring into the cold, dead eyes of a man who looked like he had been born in the mud. "The myth died in that hole," Sterling said. "They dragged Calais out by his hair. They didn't do it with the calculated respect we often show high-value targets. They did it with a deliberate, cold brutality. They wanted the surviving militia members to see their god being handled like a common criminal." As the boat troop moved toward the final extraction point at the riverbank, carrying Calais in zip ties, the geometry of the withdrawal became the final test. The West Side Boys were mounting a last, desperate counterattack. A group of 50 militia fighters had established a blocking position on the riverbank, armed with RPGs and a truck-mounted machine gun. Sterling watched the telemetry.
"They're pinned, Major. Your boat troop is trapped between the swamp and the river. You need the gunships now. Sanitize the bank." "Negative," the Major replied. "The gunships are too loud. They'll trigger a mass casualty event among the civilians in the nearby village. We'll use the vertical hammer." The vertical hammer was a maneuver that Sterling had only seen in theoretical papers at West Point. It required a level of air-ground coordination that was almost telepathic. The Chinook, Dolphin 1, which had already flown the hostages to safety, returned to the Rokel Creek. But it didn't land. It hovered at 50 feet, directly over the riverbank, and used the downwash as a tactical weapon. A Chinook's rotors produce a downward wind force of over 100 miles per hour, Sterling explained. In that mud, it creates a blinding storm of silt and debris. The militia couldn't see. They couldn't aim their RPGs, and into that storm, the SAS rearguard unleashed a sustained suppressive peel. 6 operators stood in the open, knee-deep in the mud, and fired their carbines with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. They weren't hiding. They were dominating the space. I saw an SAS sergeant, the man they called Blue, stand in the middle of the bank, his feet planted in the muck, and change magazines in 1.5 seconds while bullets were snapping past his ears. Sterling recalled. He didn't duck. He didn't flinch. He just kept the rhythm of the fire. It was the 17-second geometry applied to a 360-degree battlefield. He was the center of the storm. By 7:05, the last man of the boat troop was in the water, and the Chinook was pulling away. Operation Barras was over. Sterling sat back in his chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede. He looked at the clock. 50 minutes, from the first flare to the final extraction of the brigadier.
In less than an hour, they had rescued the prisoners, decimated a militia, captured the leader, and destroyed the cult. But the cost was finally revealed. As the helicopters landed at Lungi, Sterling saw the medics rushing to Dolphin 2. Trooper Bradley Tinian was being carried off on a stretcher. He was white as a sheet, his uniform soaked in dark, arterial blood. The SAS major stood on the tarmac, his eyes fixed on the stretcher. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He watched as his man was loaded into the field hospital. I realized then, Sterling said, that the different species isn't immune to the pain. They just have a different way of carrying it. The major knew that Tinian was dying. He knew that the mathematics of violence had demanded a sacrifice, and he stood there, absorbing that fact with a silence that was more haunting than any scream. Operation Barras was a victory that defied every American tactical manual. But for Jack Sterling, the most important lesson wasn't about the speed or the guns. It was about the institutional memory. He realized that the SAS hadn't won because they were braver than the Rangers. They had won because they were older. They were a unit built on 60 years of unbroken experience in the dirt. A unit that had learned that the most expensive equipment in the world is useless if the man behind it hasn't been flattened by the beacons. But as the sun rose over Freetown, a final question remained. A question that would haunt Sterling for the rest of his career. "We rescued the men," Sterling whispered to the major. "We got the brigadier. But was it worth the life of a man like Tinian?" The major turned to him, his eyes like cold glass. "It's not about worth, Jack. It's about the standard. If we don't go, the standard dies. And if the standard dies, we're just another army with expensive toys. We are the BS. We go where the map ends." Sterling watched as the major walked away, heading toward the debriefing room. The 20-minute miracle was over, but the geometry of the 17 seconds was now etched into the heart of the American observer. The final part of the story wasn't about the battle. It was about the legacy of the Shadow Step, and how the different species would eventually pass their cold, surgical fire to the next generation of warriors in the dark. The silence that followed Operation Barras was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a debt being paid. Major Jack Sterling stood on the edge of the tarmac at Lungi Airport as the sun began to bake the Sierra Leone soil, watching the red and white helicopter that had carried Bradley Tinian disappear toward the hospital ship RFA Argus.
30 minutes later, the word came through the radio. It was a short, clinical sentence that carried the weight of a mountain. Casualty is non-recoverable. Trooper Bradley Tinian, age 28, a man who had survived the Breen Beacons, the jungles of Brunei, and the killing house of Hereford, was dead. He was the only British fatality of Operation Barras. In the mathematics of the Pentagon, this was an acceptable loss. 1 man dead to rescue 11 and destroy a militia of 400. A statistical triumph. But as Sterling looked at the SAS Major, he saw that the British didn't use the word acceptable. The Major didn't cry, Sterling recalled. He didn't punch a wall. He just took out a small notebook, crossed out a name, and then spent the next 4 hours obsessing over the 3-second window where the militia had found a gap in the perimeter fire. He wasn't mourning the man. He was analyzing the failure of the geometry. To an outsider, it looked cold. To me, it looked like the highest form of respect. He was ensuring that the mistake that killed Tinian would never be made again. The impact of those 20 minutes on the ground in Magbeni and Gaberibana was immediate and absolute. The West Side Boys ceased to exist.
When the word spread that the boys from Hereford had come, that they had captured the invincible Papa Fode Calais in a spider hole, and that they had cleared the camps in the time it takes to brew a pot of tea, the myth collapsed. Hundreds of militia members threw their weapons into the river and vanished into the jungle. The juju was broken. The wigs and dresses were found discarded in the mud. Without the myth of the brigadier's magic, they were just frightened, drugged teenagers again. Within a year, Sierra Leone's civil war, a conflict that had claimed 50,000 lives, began its final descent into peace. The SAS didn't just win a battle, Sterling noted in his classified report to the US Army Special Operations Command. They performed a psychological decapitation of an entire insurgency. They proved that 40 men, if they are the right 40 men, are worth more than a division of conventional infantry. They proved that speed isn't just a tactic, it's a strategic weapon. When Sterling returned to Fort Bragg, he found it difficult to explain what he had seen. He sat in briefings with colonels who wanted to know about the equipment specs and the satellite integration. They wanted to know what kind of night vision the British used and what the muzzle velocity of their carbines was. They were looking for the secret sauce in the gear, Sterling said, shaking his head. I told them the secret wasn't in the gear. I told them about the 41-year-old sergeant who was faster than a 22-year-old ranger. I told them about the shadow step and the thinking soldier. I told them that the British build a man who can function when the computer fails, when the GPS fogs, and when the mission goes to hell in the first 3 seconds. Sterling's report became a controversial document within the 75th Ranger Regiment. He argued that the American reliance on overwhelming force was creating a tactical lag, a delay in decision-making caused by the need to coordinate massive support structures. He pointed to Operation Barras as the blueprint for a reduced footprint model. I told them, we are too loud, we are too heavy, we are too reliant on the machine, Sterling recalled. The British move like ghosts because they have been flattened by a selection process that teaches them that the individual is the only sensor that matters. We train our men to be part of a team. The SAS trains their men to be an army of one, and then they happen to put 4 of those men in the same room. The legacy of Operation Barras eventually fed into the creation of the modern industrial-scale raiding model that Marcus Dunlap would witness in Baghdad 5 years later. General Stanley McChrystal and the leadership of JSOC began to realize that the 20-minute miracle in Sierra Leone wasn't a fluke. It was a standard. They began to look at the killing house in Hereford not as an old-fashioned relic, but as the birthplace of the 17-second geometry. They began to emphasize target discrimination and instinctive marksmanship over volume of fire. The American machine was slowly, painfully, trying to learn the philosophy of the grueling approach. But Sterling knew there was one thing the Americans would never truly replicate: the regimental memory. The SAS has been doing this since 1941, Sterling said. They don't have a manual because they have a lineage. They have a chain of NCOs that stretches back to the Western Desert and the Malayan jungle. When a young trooper enters D-Squadron, he isn't just joining a unit. He's joining a 60-year-old conversation about how to kill an enemy in the dark with a knife and a compass. 20 years after Operation Barras, Jack Sterling, now retired, found himself in a small pub in Hereford. He was there to meet the Major, now long retired himself. They sat in a corner, far from the noise of the tourists, and drank in silence for a long time. Sterling finally asked the question he had carried since the tarmac at Lungi. "Was it the beacons, Major? Is that why you're different? Is it just the mountain?" The Major looked at his glass, the light reflecting in eyes that had seen too many 17-second geometries and too many non-recoverable casualties. "The mountain is just the gate, Jack," the Major said quietly. "Everyone thinks the long drag is about fitness. It's not. It's about the moment when you're 10 miles from the finish, your feet are bleeding, your lungs are on fire, and you realize that no one is coming to save you. Most men, even good men, look for a way out in that moment. They look for a radio or a medic or a reason to stop. The SAS operator is the man who realizes there is no way out, accepts it, and then starts walking faster." The Major leaned forward, his voice dropping. "We didn't win in Magbeni because we had better guns. Мы победили, потому что каждый из моих людей в тот момент чувствовал себя так же, как на 30-й миле драга. Мы уже приняли смерть. Мы уже были тенями. А призрака нельзя напугать джунглями." Sterling realized then that Marcus Dunlap was right. They were a different species, not because of their DNA, but because of a voluntary evolution through suffering. They were men who had traded the comfort of the machine for the terrifying freedom of the thinking soldier. As Sterling walked out of the pub and into the cool English rain, he looked toward the distant, misty peaks of the Brecon Beacons. He thought about Bradley Tinian, and he thought about the 17 seconds that would eventually shock the world in Baghdad. He realized that the Pentagon's warning, the one that said the British were too small and too cautious, was the greatest compliment they could have ever received. Because in the world of special operations, too small means you can't be seen, and too cautious means you never miss. Operation Barras remains the gold standard for hostage rescue, but its true value is found in the shadows. It is found in the silence of the shadow step and the cold, surgical fire of the vertical hammer. And it is found in the knowledge that somewhere, in a darkened room in Hereford, a 4-man team is stacking at a door. They aren't talking. They aren't checking their GPS. They are just waiting for the click of the frame charge. Because for the SAS, the jungle never ends. The 20-minute miracle is just another Tuesday, and the only standard that matters is the one written in the dirt of the beacons. Who dares, wins.